Hello, everybody. We're here in Emerging Minds with Professor Barry Schwartz. Barry Schwartz is a professor at the Haas School of Business, UC Berkeley, and emeritus professor of psychology at Swarthmore College. He has written several books about human behavior on topics like choice, wisdom, and motivation, the paradox of choice, why we work, and practical wisdom. That one was with Kenneth Sharp. He is also the recipient of the class of 2016 Commencement Award. His work focuses on the intersection of psychology and economics. He frequently published editorials in the New York Times, applying his research in psychology to current events. Schwartz's research addresses morality, decision-making, and the interrelationships between behavioral science and society. His books criticize certain philosophical roots of Western societies and expose underlying myths common in both lay and academic psychological theories. In particular, he is a critic of the rational economic man model in both psychology and economics. His research and teaching focus specifically on how the abundance of choice in modern life both liberates and bedevils those who face it. He's a fellow of both the American Psychological Association and American Psychological Society. Thank you very much, Barry, for being here with us. It's really a pleasure, and really look forward to the conversation.
I didn't recognize who you were describing. And you also left out that I taught you.
I did. That was the best part of it all, was having, I think I got the chance to have you in two of my courses at Swarthmore. So that was definitely, I would say that, if not the most, right up there as the most interesting courses I took.
Well, thank you so much. You were really challenging and interesting to have in the class.
And Professor Schwartz, just to contextualize a little bit about what's going on in our world, our industry, and giving a little bit of context of how you see this from your perspective. So we're seeing a lot of the advent of generative AI is more disruptive in certain industries than others, right? I think certain trades are less significantly disrupted, at least in the short term, than others. Translation as a language trade and falls really under the purview of a large language model. And a lot of people begin to question how much humans are still necessary to produce translations and to translate from one language to another. That gets a lot of people very scared, very, they feel threatened, they feel overwhelmed, and there's a lot more questions than there are answers as far as how to move things forward. And I guess my first question to you is, just from a broader perspective, when humans are faced with this amount or this level of disruption, based on your experience, what are key things that need to be thought of or addressed, things that you notice that people typically don't?
Well, I don't know that there's anything that I notice that other people don't, but the thing that is most concerning to me about this kind of disruption is that people are more sanguine about it, I think, than they should be. Because, when people talk about previous major technological changes, they point out that in the long run, these changes have increased rather than decreased employment and has made employment more interesting than it would otherwise have been. They keep eliminating drudgery. And I'm willing to accept that that's true. The thing that bothers me is the long run is a long run. And people don't live their lives in the long run. They live their lives in the short run. And if it takes 20 years to sort of re-stabilize the workplace and the economy as a result of this, that will wreck the lives of millions of people. I don't have a crystal ball. It does seem to me that there may be a lot of parts of our jobs that will now get done for us, which will free us up to do things that are more interesting and more rewarding, and that's good. But I don't see how this won't, in the short run, eliminate massive numbers of jobs. And unlike past technological changes, they'll be eliminating jobs of people like us. I mean, people who are educated. Well, maybe it's our turn to suffer the disruption.
Maybe the irony is upon us, but I really love what you say, because it's something that I was actually looking yesterday at a post saying, I think cars were developed, and I'm not going to cite the exact year because I don't remember exactly, but there's a big gap between when cars were first released into the marketplace, and it took, I think, maybe 50 or 60 years for people actually to stop riding horses and actually begin riding cars massively. So there's a gap between the existing technology and the adoption, but that gap has been becoming smaller. But even then, I think it's something that I think people really miss out on, is that whether you're an optimist or a pessimist, that doesn't take away from the perspective that people's lives are lived in the short term and not in the long term.
And the other thing about the gap, it's interesting you point this out. The more of a gap there is, the slower the take-up, the less disruptive the technology is, because you're not basically turning everyone's life upside down at once. You're turning a handful of people's lives upside down, and then another handful, and then another handful. So as the economy develops, you can imagine it can absorb these people into new kinds of occupations. But when it basically happens like flipping a switch, and I think you're right, the pace of technological take-up just keeps getting faster and faster. So I worry that the disruption will be greater this time than in the past, not necessarily because AI is more significant a change, but because it will be a change that is implemented more broadly and faster than previous changes. You don't have to build railroad tracks and highways. You've already sort of got the infrastructure, and it's just a question of developing the software.
Right. No, I think that's a great point. The speed that this can take place, because the infrastructure is already in place, that makes it in itself very different than the agricultural or industrial or other past revolutions. And I think now this is, I guess, kind of related, but one of the things we're at this interesting place that's full of, at least when I say we, I say we as a company, we're in this interesting place because we're technological developers. So we try to make sense of what's out there and turn this into something that's actually useful for people to remain relevant. So let's say, for instance, our position is, well, it's not a large language model or a human, but what a human can do with a large language model. And basically, how can you extend these capabilities or productivities and things like that? But it's very interesting because when we try to communicate these ideas to translators, for instance, and there are millions of translators in the world, their perspective is typically very, very afraid of what this means. They typically will see this technology as a threat, as something that's other than them and trying to replace them. So, and it's very hard to get over that. And from just your observations in this deeper psychology of decision-making and biases, what do you think can or should be done, or if this is just the way it is, to try to get people moving on to how to deal with this potential adaptation as opposed to resisting it? And I don't know if I'm making myself clear, but I guess to me, that's a question that I deal with on a daily basis, is how do you get people on this bandwagon at all?
I wish I knew, because I admire your company's desire not to make people superfluous, but to make their jobs easier and better. But I think it's inevitable, even if you don't end up putting people out of work, there will be other companies that do put people out of work, because the driver in our economic system is efficiency. The way you improve your return on investment and the way you improve the society standard of living is you find ways to do more and more with less and less. Otherwise, we're just running in place. So the temptation to take advantage of what the technology offers by reducing your production costs is overwhelming. And if you don't do it, your competition will, and they may force you to do it in self-defense. So it's hard to convince people that they won't be made expendable. And I thought a lot about translation because it's what you do, and because it actually, in a way, gets at the heart of what I'm most worried about with AI, which I assume we'll get to in a minute or two. But there are philosophers who have argued that translation is, in effect, impossible. It's a position that's sometimes called the indeterminacy of translation. And that doesn't mean that you can't come up with a translation that is an approximation, but it's not a completely faithful rendition of what was said in the original, because every word in every language carries a huge amount of context and culture with it, and finding just the right way of translating it is very challenging, and you can't do it perfectly. You can do it approximately. And my guess is that really excellent translators are few and far between, and they will not be displaced by AI, because the subtlety that they bring to the task is something that AI is not ready to match. But run-of-the-mill translators, the people who actually enable me to read something in English and get the gist of what was communicated, I suspect those people can be replaced. And so you may end up with a very elite set of translators who take what AI gives them and then tune it up, make it better. But the rest of the field is going to be, I don't know, selling newspapers, except that nobody buys newspapers anymore.
It's tough. I agree with the vision. I think that if you get a normal distribution of talent and you see, let's say, the outliers as the top performers, I would agree that those people will be able to drive in a deeper level of context and at least massage and tweak enough that content to always make it a step better. And that I do see. And I think average is at risk in most professions because average is fairly easy to replicate. It's all, and I think that part of the challenge too is that we've been under a mechanization kind of process for decades now, where like instead of emphasizing human ingenuity, creativity, more critical tasks, translators have always been paid by the word. So really what's been emphasized is output, output, output. If you don't output enough, you're going to make less. So it's not, let's say, payment has never been as a general rule in our space, never been based on the quality of the indeterminacy that's rendered. It's based on how much is output and within acceptable standards. So, and this is kind of like in a different frame, because now it's not about, well, quantity can be done fairly easily. The question now is quality. And then that runs into all of these challenges. Well, how do you measure that level of quality? How do you pay for that? Because now it's no longer a number of hours spent. Maybe you can look at something for a minute, and maybe I can look at it all day. And in your single minute, you're going to be able to arrive at something much better than I would have been able to arrive at all day. So,
and the other thing that worries me is that if machine translation takes up more and more of the market, our standards about what counts as acceptable can lower to meet what is actually being produced. Every now and then you'll see reviews of books that are written in a language other than English and then translated, and the reviewer will make a point of talking about how great the translation is and provide examples. Especially classics. Tolstoy was probably been translated God knows how many times. One translator said it this way, and one translator said it that way, and that way was so much better, so much subtler, really got the essence of what was trying to be communicated in Russian. So there's a real appreciation of translators of literature, but that's a tiny fraction of the translating that gets done. And that kind of subtlety and ability isn't needed for a lot of the work that translators do. And in addition to which, you stop missing things you stop missing high quality things when they disappear. And eventually you settle for lower quality. And
So, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think part of the basis for that rationale is around that slippery slope kind of process where you start losing quality and you continue to be used to losing quality, which leads you to lose more sense. Can you talk a little bit about that concept? Because I find it such a fascinating concept from
well,
a human perception kind of perspective.
Well, the way I think about it is that this is all parasitic on an absolutely pervasive aspect of human psychology, which is adaptation. Adaptation is we get used to things, and it's a blessing in the history of the species, since most of the things that happen to people in their lives were bad. And so having something hurt less so that you can live through the pain is a blessing. You can go about your life and you just don't think about the pain anymore. In recent times, especially in maybe only in rich societies, many of the things that happen to people have been good. You still adapt. And now you're sort of angry because you're not getting the kind of pleasure out of the $50 bottle of wine that you did when you first started being able to afford $50 bottles of wine. So it feels like your efforts to have excellent experiences keep getting subverted by your psychology. So you get used to a standard because it's what you experience all the time. And initially, when you encounter it, it's you can tell that it's really below what you had previously been used to, and that bothers you. But after a while, you get used to that standard, and people who are coming up after you never have had encounters with a higher standard, so they can't even imagine that it could be better. This is a little off the point, but I think one reason why President Biden is not getting credit for the economy is that although inflation is way down in comparison to where it was, prices are not. And eventually, it would take a miracle for prices to go back down to where they were, 3 years ago. Eventually, people will get used to the current prices. Eventually, $2.50 for a dozen eggs won't seem crazy. But at the moment, what people can tell you is, I don't care. What do you mean inflation is down? I spend 50 cents more for a dozen eggs than I did, a year ago. Eventually, we will adapt to the current level of pricing. And I think people's attitude toward the economy will improve. But it takes time to adapt. Personally, I hope we adapt before November. But yeah, that's not what we're here to talk about. So.
But I think that does tie in very much to what we're talking about, because ultimately, this concept of adaptation, right? You can adapt to both good or bad, but adaptation is a clear driver in human behavior. And I can see, for instance, a scenario where, let's say, the internet becomes a machine wasteland, where you just get worse and worse content being translated, repurposed by machines, and we just get used to seeing terrible content all over the place, and that's just what happens. But I can also envision a scenario where we adapt in the inverse direction, and we become pickier about what we read, about what's exposed to us, about the quality of that translation. And because, let's say, machines can do it, now there's a higher standard for what humans should be able to do. Now, in your opinion, what ends up being a key driver as to whether we adapt to this in a more positive or negative outcome? Or are there such drivers?
Well, no. I think you're absolutely right, but I don't think it has much to do with us. I think it has to do with whether things are getting better or things are getting worse. We're going to adapt either way.
Okay.
If we adapt to things that are because things are getting better, they'll stop seeming like they're better. They're only better because we remember what they used to be. But eventually, they're just going to be normal. And that's what's sort of so disappointing about progress is, a society makes material progress, but it doesn't feel like it's making material progress after you get used to it. It's the new normal. And normal is okay, but every now and then you'd like to have something that's better than normal. And what used to be better than normal is just normal now. There's a comedian named Louis C.K. who, before his unfortunate the revelations about his sexual preferences, he had this incredible bit about how people adapt to traveling in airplanes. Think about it. You can go across the country in 5 hours, and there are people sitting in the plane and they're pissed off because they don't have their brand of beer, and they're pissed off because the internet is slow. And, he's saying here they are sitting in the sky in a tube taking, in the old days, you'd have 3 generations dead before you got from one coast to the other. And now it happens in the space of a day. It drives them crazy, because we can't just sit back and say, isn't this amazing? And of course, when people first started flying, it was amazing. I can remember when I was 6 years old, I think, we went to Florida on vacation, and we had done it once before by train, which took a day, 24 hours. And the next time we did it on an airplane, and it was just mind-boggling that you could make a trip that's a 1,500-mile trip in a few hours. It was just mind-boggling. But I don't hear anybody getting off airplanes and saying, what a miracle I just experienced. So that's the problem. We wish we could turn adaptation off, but we can't. And we stop being satisfied with normal.
But when it comes to content, for instance, right? And I actually, this is interesting because I've been thinking about this for many years. I always meant to ask you about it. So now you have these algorithms that are basically, in my opinion, like weaponizing all the stuff that I learned at your classes. They're basically using
taking advantage of our quirks. Yeah,
exactly. They're being able to capture all of my quirks, all of my biases, all of my behaviors to get me to perform their desired output. So get me in front of Twitter or whatever for as much time as possible. In that sense, are these algorithms furthering this normalization process or this adaptation process to anything? Or like, what role do they play? Like, can they drive this like adaptation in different directions? I'd love to hear your perspectives on them.
Well, but I mean, it's interesting to think about. What I find I find the commercialization of almost everything on the internet infuriating. It drives me crazy. And I think the reason I do is that I'm old enough to remember a time when it was uncluttered in comparison to what it's like now. But my 12-year-old grandson, the way it is now is the only way he's known. So he's not bothered by it. He's not going to agitate to make it less commercial or to control it. He's not going to agitate to protect his privacy, all that stuff, because he just, grew into the use of these tools in a world where that was pervasive. Fish don't know they live in water, and he doesn't know that he lives in a world where everyone is trying to manipulate him to extract another few cents from their advertisers. So I don't know how every now and then somebody manages somehow to break the shackles of what's familiar and normal and say, well, this may be normal, but it's unacceptable. And sometimes that leads to a movement. And sometimes those movements actually produce results. But, that's not the way things normally work. Normally, the movements peter out, and the people who are in control just pretty much do whatever they want. And we have to learn to live with the consequences. So it's hard for me to be sanguine that, what's good about the technology will end up triumphing. And I should say, I don't want to sound like too much of a sour lemon here. Every time I Google something, I marvel at the quality of the results. It just stupefies me. I have not adapted to the brilliance of their search tools. And we moved from the East Coast to the West Coast about 8 years ago. And the existence of Google Maps had the most amazing influence on the quality of the move, because we didn't have to worry about getting lost. And we didn't have to worry about opening up these gigantic road maps and trying to figure out while we were moving what exit to get off and what turn to make, And so we were much more willing to explore than we would have been if we had made the move 25 years before. And it was, so we felt liberated. It made adapting to a new environment basically a piece of cake in comparison to how it would have been. So I don't take any of that stuff for granted. I suspect that a lot of people do, but for me, every day is miraculous.
And I love that perspective. I guess what I'm curious is, you're in this scenario, you're still describing, let's say you have a very cautious outlook on technology and this getting used to anything and forgetting what virtuous or good means in the process. But you're still looking at Google Maps as a tool. You're not seeing Google Maps, let's say, as something that's going to render you useless or not effective or compromising your human integrity. You're being able to leverage that as a tool. Now, let's say Google Maps got really a lot better to the point where it's actually telling you where to go or suggesting where to go. Now that kind of like becomes different. And I guess specifically, as far as like human biases and cognitive processes, do you think there's anything that people could be aware about, like as far as how their own mind operates, and so that they like have a higher hand an upper hand when it comes to their own agency and understanding what kinds of processes are taking place that could help them look at these things as tools as opposed to opponents?
Well, the way people who study decision making have come to think about our cognitive processes when we have to make decisions is not encouraging, because the common view these days is that there are essentially two systems that operate in the mind. One of them, which is what we are aware of when we make decisions, is slow, deliberate, orderly, and we're conscious of it. So when we're having trouble making a decision, we realize it. When we make a good decision, we realize it. And we realize what we're thinking about as we think about things to make a decision, so that if we get it wrong, we'll do better the next time. The other system is fast, it's automatic, and it operates outside of awareness. In the same way that our visual perception operates outside of awareness. If I asked you, how can you tell how fast the car is moving toward you? You have no idea. You don't know what the machinery of perception is, but lucky for you, your visual system does. And so, but what you do know is that you can answer the question, how fast is that car going? Which enables you to stay alive in the world. So if there's a significant component of your decision making that occurs outside of awareness and that is opaque to you, then I'm not optimistic that you can get enough control over that system so that if you're being manipulated, as you surely are and will be all the more, you can prevent the manipulation from affecting what you do. And so I think when it comes to the manipulators versus the manipulators are likely to win.
Wow. Yeah, hard. That's hard to digest, because I always like to think of myself as the being able to take things with a grain of salt and extract that salt and find the hidden information. But I guess
I think you can, but you can't to the degree that you may think you can. You may think you're bulletproof because you're technologically sophisticated, and you're not bulletproof. You're just less likely to get a vital organ pierced by a bullet than somebody who's not as sophisticated as you are.
Yeah, it's painful to admit, I guess, that, for instance, for me, I see my children, one of my 10-year-old loves playing video games and computer games, and I see how these games are manipulating him super clearly, and like he
Mhm.
he they're so good, like he doesn't want to leave, and like
Yeah.
he'll be really upset when we make him leave. And it's hard for me to reconcile that I'm just like him. And
Well, you're probably not just like him. There's a kind of continuum of sensitivity. But the thing is that this too is something that the people who design these games are aware of. So they find, it's easier to hook a 10-year-old than it is to hook a 25-year-old or a 40-year-old. But that doesn't mean you can't hook a 25-year-old or a 40-year-old. It just means you have to be subtler in what you do. And the evidence that has come out in the case of social media rather than games, that there was a deliberate effort to find aspects of the experience that would be the addictors. Just as the tobacco companies added nicotine once they found out that that was what addicted you to cigarettes, they boosted the nicotine content of cigarettes so that it would be harder and harder to resist addiction. And that's exactly what the social media people did. They figured out which, the like button was the holy grail when it came to how much people use social media. And once they discovered this, boy, you couldn't get them to get rid of it if your life depended on it. But what this tells you, I think, is that rather than relying on our autonomy and agency, we probably need to rely on government entities regulating the way in which the technology is developed and the way in which it is deployed. And that's going to piss people off. I know there's a kind of libertarian streak in the tech world, but I have absolutely no confidence that it will regulate itself. Anyone who believes that is a fool. And so I think we just have to acknowledge that it needs to be regulated by somebody who doesn't have a financial interest the way the tech world does. And the problem is that the people who are in charge of regulating are so ignorant in comparison to the people in technology. I'll never forget one of the times Zuckerberg was called to testify in Congress, and somebody asked him, he said, "So how does Facebook make money?" He couldn't believe that he was being asked that question because he thought by now everyone in the world knew how Facebook made money. But for this person, it was like a mystery. It's free. How can you make money? So, having legislators that are 12 steps behind the technology does not encourage much confidence either.
Yeah. And I have to agree with you. I mean, I don't see, let's say, market forces by themselves driving ethical product
Never have.
creation. But tying this back to the thing you said first, where like life is lived in the short term, experience in the short term, but these things all are happening in the long term. There's this huge gap, right, between the release of these things and the regulation that follows. So,
Sure.
People were smoking cigarettes for decades before regulators said, hey, no, this is really bad. And even then, it's still highly advertised. Sure, they have their warnings and all of that, but it's still abused,
Yep.
maybe less, but it doesn't really fix. Maybe it just curbs a little bit the problem, but doesn't really fix it. But in your opinion, I'm just curious, like, why do you think is this gap in between, let's say, adoption and actual regulation? Is that just inefficiency at governmental agencies level, or is that kind of almost a deliberate ploy to allow the first, let's say, the most amount of profit to be extracted to then be like, okay, now let's move on to the next thing?
I don't know. I don't know that I can answer that question with confidence, but I think you don't need to be conspiratorial to understand the gap for a couple of reasons. One is that the people who are in positions of regulating and control know less than the people they're trying to regulate and control. And so they have to catch up. That's one problem. Second problem is that somebody who knows a lot makes more money working for Google than he does working for the government agency that regulates Google. So it's hard to get the kind of talent you need, even if it's out there, because you can't entice them away. The third is that there are certain problems that you can't really tell are problems until something is widely used and used for large periods of time.
Right.
So I don't think anyone saw what was coming in social media when they first appeared. It just seemed like a novelty. It was cute. And by the time the magnitude of its influence started to become clear, the people who might regulate were so far behind the curve that it was going to take a long time to catch up. So maybe there's conspiracy.
No, and I don't even mean to hint at that. I think that the key thing for me, what's mind-boggling, is that I've read research that shows that, for instance, social media is more addictive than nicotine. Mm-hmm. And yet, I don't know how long it's going to take, for instance, for social media to be deemed illegal for 18 and under. And I don't even know if that's ever going to happen.
And I don't either. The fact that the House just overwhelmingly passed this bill to force TikTok to get sold was astonishing to me. And they use the tools they have. I think banning use of applications until you're a certain age that's far in the future. But requiring parental controls is not as far in the future. Regulating content is maybe not so far in the future. There are free speech issues that are going to slow all this down in a way that was not a problem when it came to nicotine. Although there is still in the United States this attitude that people have the right to destroy themselves, and all you can do is give them the information. You can't prevent them. Right. And part of the reason why it took so long to really put the screws to the cigarette companies, I think, was that it's, I'm telling you, it's killing you. You still want to use it? It's a free country.
Right.
And what changed people's attitudes about that, by the way, and here, this may be relevant, what changed people's attitudes about smoking was secondhand smoke. The evidence that started to appear that when you smoked, you weren't just killing yourself, you were also killing other people. That made it a moral issue. And once it became a moral issue, all of a sudden, attitudes toward smoking changed. It was no longer the case that your right to smoke ended the discussion. And if you can show that there are secondhand smoke-like effects of social media, which, by the way, there must be, of course, then I suspect that would give you real leverage to impose more control over the companies that produce it. Don't you think?
I agree. That's a fascinating argument. I never thought about that connection, because that's where it transcends individual liberty, when you're actually harming the
other people. And it's not far-fetched. You have this explosion of depression, anxiety, drug use, and suicidality in young people. Well, those people suffer, but society suffers. Society loses their potential productivity. The society has to pay a lot of money for them to be taken care of. And so is it the same as secondhand smoke? It's a bit of an extension, but the truth is that when you crush the well-being of an individual, society shares the cost of taking care of that individual. And society shares the loss of productivity of that individual. No, I haven't read anything that talks about this as an analog to secondhand smoke, but it kind of is.
It kind of is.
And all of a sudden it becomes everybody's problem, and not just the problem of the people who have become addicted to social media.
It's very interesting, because if you expand on that, any user of any technology, right, they're tied in to all other users. There's a network effect in everything. And it seems it's very hard for us as a society to analyze things systemically within this network, right? We always analyze individually, but it's hard for us to bring this all together. And I want to tie this to something that you also were describing, which is there's a mismatch in incentives, right? There's a lot more incentive to, let's say, manipulate than the incentive to curb that manipulation. And that way, and that happens all around, right? Let's say, for instance, you make less money, a lot less money, for instance, teaching and enabling the next generation of leaders than you do, for instance, selling derivatives in finance, right? There's there are certain professions and certain traits that are essential to the upkeeping of and the integrity of this social fabric and network that just seem to be continuously undervalued.
Mhm.
Do you see any kind of way for us to use, I don't know, even through this technology or through any other mechanisms, any way to at some point begin to change these incentives framework, or is this just the way free markets work?
I have spent my career, as you well know, since you studied with me, I have spent my career ranting and raving about the evils of using market structures as the tool for organizing all aspects of our social lives. The market has its place. That place is not every place, but everything you see day after day after day increases rather than decreasing the scope of a market framework. So it seems to me, at least in the US, that trying to really curb where the market exerts itself is a non-starter. Now, it may not be this way forever, but it certainly is this way now. And right now, I don't know how much you care about this, but I'm a big sports fan, and it has always driven me crazy that colleges and universities essentially have professional athletes who don't really get degrees and who don't get paid. On the other hand, acknowledging that they're professional athletes is even worse. Why should Alabama have a professional football team? What sense does it make for a university to have a professional team? And what's happened, partly in response to the way in which athletes have been exploited in the last 5 years, is that the veil over the professionalism of the athletes has been lifted. And now they can make money, they can't get paid a salary for playing, but they can effectively get paid a salary for playing. And they now are. There are people making, $500,000 from the use of their likeness and from being in ads and stuff like that. So we're this far away from fully and honestly and openly professionalizing college athletics, which makes no sense to me. And it already has, transform what goes on the playing field, and how important it will be to people that the students, so-called students, actually have time to go to class and do their homework. So I see this as moving in the wrong direction in the US, and things will have to get worse before people are willing to entertain the possibility that we need to be looking for ways to constrain the market's influence rather than exploiting the market's influence. And here's let me give you one other piece of this, which is particularly salient to me in connection with AI. You do translation, and the thing about translation is that you are indifferent about whether the thing you are translating is true. All that matters is that the translation is a faithful replica of the original. Whether the original was true is of no interest to you. At least at this moment in general AI, there is absolute indifference to whether what the AI is scraping to learn how to do these nice English texts, linguistic texts. It is completely indifferent to whether the stuff that's being scraped is true. It doesn't matter. What the question is it intelligible?
Right.
Does it seem like it's English? Could I submit this as a term paper? Whether there's a single true sentence in it is of a complete indifference. So if the source of data is corrupt, then the output of the program will be corrupt vis-a-vis truth. And as we all know, what has happened is that it's the ratio of true to false statements in the digital world keeps getting lower and lower. I'm trying to teach my 12-year-old grandson, when he Googles something, that he needs to look at the source, that you just can't trust what you're reading. You have to look at where it's coming from. And slowly, I think he's getting, he's coming to understand that you have to be suspicious. And that's terrifying to me, because I think without the internet, we are having increasing difficulty maintaining our standards with regard to the importance of what's true and how you figure out what's true and why it matters to be able to trust the sources of information that you're going to. And I worry that younger people who grow up in this environment will be indifferent to truth. And AI is only going to perpetuate that because it's indifferent to truth. Now, you could do it differently. You could create general intelligence software that is exquisitely sensitive to truth. But that's not what's being done now, because that's not the goal. The goal is intelligibility, not validity. And by the time people wake up and say this is bad, it may really, an enormous amount of damage may have been done. And here too, commercialization is indifferent to truth. It's expensive to find out what's true. It takes a long time.
Yeah.
And if you're trying to make a buck, you're not interested in taking a long time. And if nobody's going to hold your feet to the fire, why would you bother? So and it's interesting to me, the only major application I'm aware of that has not been corrupted by the explosion of financial opportunities online is Wikipedia. I think it has its problems. I don't want to suggest that it's perfect. It certainly isn't. But it is the only thing I know of that's not trying to make money. I don't think it's an accident that the one thing you can hold up as a beacon that we might aspire to is the one thing that is not trying to make money. And everything else, no matter how pure the idea was that got them started on the path, after a while, they got shareholders to answer to, and they want to be profitable, and they want to drive a fancy car and have a house in every state. And, it's inevitable that you start to make compromises, and the compromises get bigger and bigger and bigger until it's no longer obvious why you continue to do what you do, because you're not serving the mission that got you started anymore. So I have a dim view of what happens when the market penetrates areas of life that would be much better without it.
So, and I agree, but in the alternative scenario where you have more regulation, how do you make regulators not just make things more bureaucratic and
it's a huge problem.
Think about
a huge problem, and you also have the problem that people refer to as regulatory capture,
right?
Which is, people work as regulators and they're tired of making, $90,000 a year, so they then go and work for the companies that they've just been regulating,
right?
So they know the ins and outs of the regulation process so well that they can find ways to circumvent regulations of various kinds. And they have a lot more resources than the government does to do that. So it's an uneven match.
But how do you create regulation that's based on, let's say, design thinking and overall architecting a certain kind of desired social outcome, as opposed to just putting in barriers?
I'm a reasonably smart guy, and I've been living for a long time. I don't know how to answer that question. If you know how to answer that question, open your mouth and yell, because man, that is so hard.
No, it seems to me that we're stuck between a rock and a hard place, because the markets don't seem to do their job. It seems to me, at least so far, especially at the rate at which innovation is taking place seems to getting faster. The
Mhm.
social fabric doesn't seem to be adjusting as quickly. The regulatory fabric also doesn't seem to be keeping up to pace. And it just feels like, at least based on our conversation, it seems to me so much is left to the individual to be
I
able
think
to
that's right.
navigate their way.
We're on our own, and if we're on our own, we lose. So I wish government were more efficient. I wish more talented people would see that as a sensible path. Um, I have a feeling that in other countries where the sort of social welfare system takes care of more of our expenses in life so that acquiring wealth is less important. It's probably easier to have top quality people choosing to work, in the public sector because their healthcare is taken care of, the education of their kids is taken care of, yada, yada, yada. So, they'll have a slightly smaller house, but they'll be able to live a good life and they're doing something of social value. Uh, but when you're sort of on your own with respect to almost everything, which is the way people in the US live, then no matter how much you have, it may not be enough. I mean, who could ever have dreamt that it would cost $80,000 a year to send your kid to college?
Right.
And, that's what it costs now. By the time your 10-year-old goes to college, it won't cost
I don't even
80,000.
want to think about that.
I can understand that. So there's just nothing. The more people have to rely on themselves, the more inclined people will be to take a path that enables them to live them and their family to live the kind of life they want to live, which almost certainly means being on the wrong side when it comes to finding a good balance between innovation and regulation.
And let's say, for instance, just in the hypothetical scenario, we were able to arrive at a model that's able to reverse engineer the desired individual behavior to, for instance, incentivize towards very smart regulation, like almost like an algorithm that we would see in social media that like makes me stay there and like the stuff, like would drive me towards, I want to regulate AI. I want to learn about these social networks, and not just pays me for this, but like extracts from me a more ethical or
Mhm.
virtuous or conscientious behavior. Is that the fact that this behavior would be manipulated out of me, for instance? How would that make you feel? Like if I were able to act virtuously, but through this level of
Well, but
manipulation?
look, I think that's the way we are. People don't talk about education as brainwashing, but education is brainwashing. You're trying to give people a particular take on the world, and it isn't just how do you do algebra. It's what does it mean to be a good person? Why is it important to be honest? Why is it important to be kind? Why is it important not to use racial epithets? All of this we're being socialized in. Um, and so if we find subtler ways to achieve the kind of character in people that we think society needs, that's progress, I guess. You don't need to use a sledgehammer anymore. You can nudge people in the direction of being good people and wanting to do things that make the world somewhat better and safer and so on. Uh, until we get used to it, it's going to feel like we're being manipulated because we are, but we've always been manipulated. Um, and and they've just gotten more sophisticated in the tools they've developed to manipulate us. But I'd rather be manipulated to get off social media than be manipulated to get on social media. And I'd
That's for
certainly
sure.
rather that my grandkids get manipulated in that way.
That's for sure. Well, Professor Schwartz, really a huge
Stop calling me Professor Schwartz.
very
You're too old to call me Professor Schwartz.
thank you so much. This was a huge pleasure. I mean, very eye-opening conversation. I think to me the key takeaway really is there I don't see easy fixes or routes, but I do think that we have a much bigger role to play in all of this than most of us typically think of on a daily basis. And that's personally what keeps me going, is trying to be more and more aware of maybe I don't have a lot that I can do, but I have more than I typically lead myself to believe.
I think that's right. We have more we can do than we appreciate. I think that's right. And this was a pleasure, Gabe.
Perfect. For everybody watching, thank you so much. And if you like this episode, please remember to like, subscribe, and look forward to hearing more. Bye-bye. Thank you, Barry.